Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm your instructor, Professor Wary, and it is my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Professor Ruha Benjamin, a sociologist in the African American Studies Department here at Princeton, and the founder of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So let's just get started. So most people, they can imagine how sociologists and other social scientists are going to study neighborhoods, crime, deviance, but they seem to get a little confused when they see us studying technology. It would seem to most folk that by its nature, technology is socially neutral, but you say no. Why?
That's right. I mean, most of our engagement with technology is after it's already created. And so we often don't see the social interactions, the social processes that go into its creation. It's what scholars call black boxed. That means it's kind of put away and we don't see how it's produced. Whereas with these other social arenas, we can see the people moving in and out of neighborhoods or out of employment or education. And so part of the mystique of technology is that the human agency, the values, the desires, the worldviews that shape it are hidden from view. They're behind the screen. And so I think that's what leads many people to initially become a little confused about how are you as a sociologist studying it, because they often don't see how socially constructed technology is. And so I think one of the first things we have to do is kind of pull back the screen and say, look at all the people. And in fact, one of the issues is that right now there's a small sliver of humanity that's doing most of the construction, most of the design, which then leads to all of the kind of social problems and issues that people in my subfield tend to focus on.
Yeah, which is why I so love your book, Race After Technology. And in it, you actually warn against this thing that you call the new Jim Code. Jim Crow, I know. And until I read your book, Jim Crow, the new Jim Code, I did not know. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
And so that's precisely why I settled on that term, because it would be both familiar and strange. So I wanted to tap into that familiarity that many people, at least in the US, have in naming the form of white supremacy and institutionalized racism and everyday kind of norms of racism that we associate with Jim Crow, and then the new Jim Crow as popularized by Michelle Obama, which in and of itself is naming a succession, a way that racial domination continues to permeate our lives through another kind of institution, which is the carceral sort of apparatus. And so I wanted to plug into that narrative of succession to talk about how today so much of racism and racial domination is facilitated by emerging technologies. And it's even more dangerous because it's hidden and because people don't question it because it's coming to them through a screen or coming to them something that's considered neutral. So when you begin to pair both a tool for reproducing racism and this idea of neutrality, that's a kind of deadly combination that the new Jim Crow is trying to name, that is innovation that enables social containment, but it's hidden from view.
Hidden from view. And indeed, your book takes us through the different forms of the new Jim Code. And so can you break those down for us?
Sure. And so I'll say that, when I first started this project in 2016, what initially got me really interested was seeing these kind of headlines and hot takes in the media about so-called racist robots and sexist robots. And in that case, robots were a kind of heuristic or a shorthand for journalists and kind of pundits to name automation and emerging technology. So it's kind of a catch-all. And so I was curious about the framing of that in the popular media. And initially I adopted that kind of flattened framing, which is just naming it all as racism by other means. And as I began writing and through conversation with colleagues, they kind of pushed me to say, okay, you need to be more nuanced in your analysis. That means it's not all just racism, as if it's all taking shape in the same way through all of these very different technologies, as if it's all the same, which led me to think about, okay, what are some what I think of as kind of offspring concepts? Like, how do I break down this larger idea of the new Jim Code, innovation that enables containment, and look at the different manifestations of it? And so each of 4 chapters breaks down from the most obvious forms, like we can see it coming, we can see the harm coming, to the more insidious forms, the way that even technologies that are packaged as progress and promise to address bias in various ways, how sometimes they can actually help reproduce inequality unwittingly. And so it's kind of a spectrum, starting with engineered inequity, which is the more obvious kinds. It's kind of like the people who are creating it are like, we want to create stratified groups. Let's create a tool like a social credit system or something to help make sort of classify people and hierarchize people. Like, it's very obvious. And then from there, we move to default discrimination, which is where the people who are designing the technologies, they're not necessarily setting out to create the harm or the inequity, but precisely by ignoring history, precisely by ignoring the social inequality that exists, they unwittingly reproduce not just racial, but gendered, classed, and other forms of inequality and domination. And so default discrimination means that the social defaults of our world become embedded in the technology and reproduce them. And then we move to coded exposure, which is really looking especially at visual technologies. And, it kind of marries the desire of racialized groups to be seen by these technologies, like literally seen, where the little green light over your computer, like for a while, it had a hard time detecting people with darker skin. Like, so it's a kind of desire to be recognized. But the flip side of that is many of these same technologies are train their attention on racialized populations through surveillance systems. And so coded exposure is trying to wrestle with that dialectic of being both neglected and also surveilled, and looking at that conundrum. And then the last variety of the new Jim Code is what I term Techno Benevolence, which names the most insidious kinds, because the people who are creating it, they hope to, or at least promise to, address bias in various guises. So for example, in the context of employment, there are many companies coming online that promise to help to streamline the process of recruiting new hires to various companies. And in doing so, they create very elaborate AI systems. They do data-driven talent, scouting. So I would sit here and do my interview, and it would be keeping track of my posture and my tone and my eye contact. And then it would compare my score to those of existing employees in a company. Now, the top performing employees. So say a company like Amazon, which a few years ago rolled out its own hiring algorithm and found that it routinely weeded out all of the female applicants, all of the women applicants. In part, we have to look at who's there at Amazon and the gender dynamics there, so that the algorithm, anytime a resume or an interviewee had any kind of gendered language or said they were on the college, the women's chess team or whatever, it would root them out. And so precisely that the dynamics that already existed then get built in to train the algorithm to look for more of the same. Now, the reason why it's Techno Benevolence is because these software companies are really promising to get beyond the bias that we know exists in employment. And so that's like, well, we know that people are biased, so let's turn to the algorithm, sort of outsourcing decisions. And hundreds of companies worldwide have been using it, everyone from Goldman Sachs to the Atlanta Public School System to Vodafone. So It's being picked up, even at the level of the science, the idea that it's data-driven talent, even before we get to the bias aspect of it, it can't actually do what it promises to do. And so that just gives you a feel for the spectrum and the kind of variety of technologies and processes that I'm describing and analyzing in Race After Technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's most remarkable for me is the extent to which I used to think about technology as innovation, and as being able to move away from where we were. And to a large extent, what you're showing is how technology keeps us stuck in place.
And so certainly that is, so that's definitely one takeaway. The other is that racism itself is innovative. And so, so in terms of the way that it changes form, so we can't do it like this anymore. We can't actively discriminate and keep schools segregated. So we'll create private schools and we'll keep testing and we'll do all of these things. And so if we begin to understand that racism is innovative, then it becomes less kind of jarring to understand that technology aids and abets racism in that innovation, rather than necessarily casting it as backward or something like that.
And so in the time that we now live, we're seeing protesters all over the country calling for defunding the police. And part of that defund demand, as I can see it, is to stop using technology as digital eyes to watch the public. And so when you think about digital eyes watching the public, why should this be worrisome to us?
Yeah, and so it began to, worry is the wrong word, I sort of started paying attention to the calls to defund the police and how narrowly or expansive that was imagined. And I was concerned that we would only limit our protest or our concern about the violence inherent to policing and narrow that to the flesh and blood officers with uniforms, with badges, and not recognize how the logic of policing, the tools of surveillance and policing have been embedded well beyond the actual institution of policing, like that it infiltrates our schools, our hospitals, our banks. And so what I'm hoping for in even getting us to think about those digital eyes is that it's not just the police who employs that, right? Private companies and entities do. And so we see that the kind of flexibility that it permeates so many areas of our lives. And so I'm hoping that as the calls, we've seen a number of municipalities have either slashed the budgets or said, we're going to take the money, let's say, from policing and put it into education. But if we notice that the educational budget, how much of that goes to hiring officers in schools or hiring various kinds of risk assessment software programs to track youth behavior, then we see that just moving money around across institutions without recognizing how the same logics and tools can be found in other areas of our lives means that call to defund the police is not going to get rid of policing. It's just going to innovate and find a way of being exercised in other arenas. And so one of the organizations, for example, that I've worked with in St. Paul, where this all started with George Floyd, a few years ago, the public schools and the police department created what it called the Innovation Project, which was a project that would collect data on youth, everything about them, their families, and then create a risk assessment to intervene early on those youth that were deemed likely to get into trouble later. And again, the umbrella, the framing was innovation. It was a collaboration, all the buzzwords. But the organizations on the ground were savvy enough to know that no matter what you call this, the fact that, one, you're using this already stigmatizing language of at risk, you're feeding the algorithm that will produce this score all of this data that is what they call deficit data, all of the things that's going wrong within people's lives. And then you're doing it under the guise of helping. These community orgs, they knew better, and they started organizing focus groups. They started producing their own sort of counter data and sort of mobilizing, and eventually had this innovation project not only halted, but had the money that was going into that put into more community-led approaches to supporting youth through a more asset lens. And so that's just one of many examples of piercing through the rhetoric of tech speak and all the ways that it exceeds just the police, in this case, the educational system, and where scholars can partner with community organizations to create research and tools that can be useful to them in advocating for the kinds of investments that they want.
And so when it comes to how we train future technologists in universities, for example, what are the implications of your work for pedagogy?
Yeah, there's so much great work happening to rethink training, to rethink what is essential knowledge for people going into various STEM fields, but especially kind of computer science, computer engineering, data sciences. And is it enough just to be an expert on the kind of technical know-how to build systems without this historic understanding of the data that you're producing and using, the sociological insights? And so there are programs starting to evolve more interdisciplinary approaches. Many at initially have a more additive approach. They'll have an extra class here or extra module here, but there are other programs that are being built around this idea of public interest technology. The idea that both the people who create it and then the ecosystem that governs it should be thinking about what's in the best interest of the public and not the bottom line. And so one very concrete tool that folks can look up is called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech Handbook, that was created by the Data and Society Research Institute in New York. And it's a short handbook you can download, and it's trying to build both the kind of intellectual sort of literacy, emotional literacy, and then the kind of action, like how do you actually use this in practice? And I guess the last thing I'll say is, one of the examples, I'm always surprised by how many, even not students, but teachers. Like I just spoke to computer science teacher, K through 12 teachers all over the US, their annual conference. And I provided an example of the fact that IBM, the company IBM, was such a major player in the Holocaust. And the number of educators for whom that was brand new knowledge was really interesting to me, because if they don't know it, they certainly can't offer that kind of historical insight to their students or to their classes. And for me, there are so many cautionary features of just that collaboration, IBM and the Holocaust, because many of the people who were involved were just doing their job. They were just clocking in and out. It was a bureaucracy of evil where people were not asking the big questions, like, what is this data being used for? What are these punch cards being used for? And so precisely by putting their head down and just doing their job, they enabled this atrocity of global proportions. And so the question for us is, when we're putting our heads down now and just doing our job, what are we missing? What kinds of collaborations, let's say, between Microsoft and ICE, or between another company and police departments? What are we enabling by just doing our job? And so it's that kind of questioning that I'm encouraging, not just at the university level, but in the training, even at the high school, secondary level.
And now, as we are getting this convergence of COVID-19, police violence, what are some of the technological issues that we should be concerned about?
So the list is long, and I won't spend too much time on it, but just think of it like this. This is a global catastrophe, and there are people who, for their whole career, their whole MO is to profit from catastrophe.
Yes.
And they wait to zoom in and provide solutions, in this case, tech solutions that are, often private companies with their stakeholders first before thinking about the public good. But the rhetoric will always be the public good. And so whether we're talking about the companies that are zooming in to collaborate with the New York Public Schools right now on remote learning, or the company, for example, Palantir is a company that has helped create most of the infrastructure for ICE and our military. And they are the ones who now are being contracted to create the contact tracing apps, public health apps. And so the very company that has already shown itself to be sort of a tool for state-sanctioned racism in other domains is the one now being handed the reins to create this public health infrastructure. And we know that public health has often been a way of policing by other means. And so whether we're talking about education or the public health side of things, or we're talking about the overcrowding in prisons and the risk assessment tools that are being used in many prisons to decide who to let out and who to keep to avoid overcrowding, at every turn, we're seeing the way that the new Jim Code and automated inequality is infiltrating the solutions to these converging pandemics. And so we need students, we need scholars, we need advocates to be paying attention and to shine a light and not to drink the Kool-Aid of techno utopia that these tools are going to save us. They have to be in the hands, and the problems that they address have to be conceived by the communities that have historically been most harmed by innovation and progress.
Yeah, so I think the final thing I'll ask you is just to tell us a little bit about the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, because it sounds as though it was an idea that that thank goodness has arrived, and has arrived just in time.
Yeah, so sure. I actually founded this in 2018 when I was a faculty fellow at the Center for Digital Humanities. But then I went on leave and I didn't do much with it for about a year while I was on leave. And then as we pivoted online in the spring, again, I wasn't teaching, I was still on sabbatical, but I noticed that a lot of the students that were graduating or becoming rising seniors had lost their internships, had lost their job opportunities. And so I wanted to find a way to employ as many of them as possible, but with meaningful employment, where it wasn't just clocking in, but where people cared about what they were doing. And so I designed a kind of research agenda for this summer, in which I employed 42 students to partner with community organizations. There are 10 teams that focus on everything from policing in prisons to education to work to mourning, thinking about how people grieve during this time, to the arts. And so all of this spectrum of teams, but they're not coming up with their particular projects on their own. They're partnering with community organizations that are doing racial justice, COVID-related racial justice work, and building data justice tools that can be used for education and advocacy. And so we're almost to the end of this particular, building this, what we're calling a pandemic portal. And we'll be posting all of the tools by the time people see this video, you can go to thejustdatalab.com and check out the 10 different tools that have grown out of this. But we're continuing the work. So we'll have a new cohort of research associates in the fall that will continue the relationships with the community orgs and continue to hone the tools or build new ones. So it's just trying to model this idea of community partnership and building knowledge and employing data for justice, rather than allowing data to continue to be weaponized against our communities.
And with that, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course.